Lovely. So welcome back, everyone. I hope these sort of regular breaks are just letting everybody sort of keep a little bit limber as we were keeping going, sort of deluging with a solid block of Zoom. I think we've all learned that that's not a great thing. So we've peppered the day with regular breaks, which I think is probably a good thing. I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Williams to talk to us today. Dr. Williams is a consultant in paediatric endocrinology and diabetes and is currently in between multidisciplinary team meetings and ward rounds and things like that at the moment. So we're very grateful for her finding the time for us today. But she's also a key member of the medical education team in the clinical school at Cambridge University, and as well as being a director of studies in that messy way that Cambridge's education system is built up. But I'm really pleased to be having sort of the contrast with the picture of how libraries are going to be building back better and working in things that they may take forward and keep, and being bold in the changes that they've made. I'm really grateful to have the perspective from Rachel about how the impact on medical education of the past year's craziness, and what things might be kept and what things will be ditched at the first possible opportunity, because just because we can doesn't mean to say that we should. And I'm really delighted to have Rachel join us today. So Rachel, I'll hand over to you if you want to share screen, and we'll take questions at the end as ever. Stick them in the chat. Do use Twitter. And thank you very much, Rachel.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this really kind invitation, and Isla for that kind introduction. It's a huge honour to have been invited to speak to you all today. As Isla said, I work in Cambridge at the School of Medicine, and I'm going to be talking today about really as I reflect on this talk, it feels a bit self-indulgent. It's really just our journey over the last 12 months when it all kicked off. But I'm going to focus on the adjustments that we've had to make within our medical education over the last year, and to comment on what I feel should stay in the aftermath of the COVID epoch, which I assume we all hope is fairly soon. So there are three broad areas that I'm going to be talking about today. Warning / spoiler, depending on your perspective. My main focus is going to be on assessment. Perhaps because that's occupied the most airtime over the last 12 months, although to be fair, even prior to COVID, assessment's often a popular topic for both faculty and students. I'll also be considering some of the changes we've made to our teaching, highlighting some wins and perhaps some less effective interventions. And finally, I want to comment on my experiences with large group CPD delivery for healthcare professionals. And as I go, I'd love to hear any comments or experiences that you've had. So let's go back in time to just over a year ago, the end of February 2020. I look back and I feel almost as though we sleepwalked into it, really. So COVID was very much on the way, and the NHS was getting ready. But I think still within that, and anyone who's got that dual NHS academic role will realise it was a very, very difficult time. There was huge uncertainty, and however, it became very clear that the arrival was going to be inevitable and that it was going to have huge impact on everyone. And the first real discussions that took place were around assessment, because the coincidental arrival of cancellation COVID, as it's known in our house, coincided neatly with the beginning of our assessment programme. And the big problem is that both our clinical and written assessments are usually, under normal circumstances, conducted by putting large numbers of people, some of whom are clinically vulnerable, into small spaces for prolonged periods of time. And this shows the timeline. So in April, our finalists was to be sitting their final clinical assessments. May, our intermediate year 5 were to be sitting all of their written and clinical assessments. And in July, we'd got our 4th years who were going to do their very early clinical and written assessments. And so in terms of our planning, an awful lot was driven actually in the end by the needs of the NHS. The redeployment of staff meant that the available numbers of staff and examiners were reduced, and there was a plan to graduate also a whole cohort of students early across the whole of the UK to enable to join the workforce as part of the redeployment. So we were in a position where we had to graduate year 6 far earlier than planned. Our students were going home. There was nothing in place at that point which enabled us to keep our students on clinical placements. In hindsight, if there was one thing I'd change, it would probably be that. I would have kept them, but that's where we are. So it was abundantly clear that our usual model of assessment was going to have to change, and change fast, taking into consideration all of these things. However, this is on a background of all of the stakeholders. So the GMC have been very clear throughout all of this that there can be no compromise on standards. And medical schools, as I'm sure you're all aware, are required to deliver competent graduates who protect the public by delivering safe and competent medical care. And also, it's really important to take into consider our students delivering a fair and, let's face it, legally defensible assessment. I put staff in the smallest font on this slide. This is by no means a reflection of my own personal view, but this is the point that I'd really like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the enormous and tireless contribution of all of our support staff, who may not always have been considered as part of these decisions. Often there's we have to do this, and it sets it presses play on a chain of events, and then everyone just has to catch up. So I think staff should also be in a bigger font on the stakeholders slide. So back to our exams. What are the options? We had a big meeting. And as you can imagine, there were a number of different views that were put across. So this was largely around assessment. And I think at this point, this was at the end of February, and at this point, I think we hadn't quite appreciated that actually there weren't really going to be any students in Cambridge to have assessments. So the focus was really around social distancing and how risky that was, how risky it would be to do our normal assessments. So there was a huge pressure to just do an OSCE on Zoom. We're all quite good at Zoom now, but this was at a time when even a successful screen share caused the thrill of success, and breakout rooms were at that point a thing of mystery. So it was, in the whole era of learning around remote delivery, it was a long time ago. For me, however, the most important consideration when thinking about this was that none of our students had ever undertaken a video consultation with a patient. And therefore it seemed grossly unfair to submit them to a high-stakes summative assessment, doing a task that none of them had ever previously undertaken. I think it's fair to say there was a fairly robust discussion that ensued. My role is mainly in clinical exams, but I'm going to try and comment on written exams as I go. And essentially at that time we had no platform, actually, and still don't have a platform on which to deliver written exams other than paper and in a face-to-face exam hall. And there remain huge issues around the country about remote invigilation and that sort of thing. So I'll comment a little bit about that later. So aside from making people do something they'd never done before to decide whether they were competent to be doctors, other things we considered was doing the exams face-to-face using appropriate PPE, abandoning altogether, postponing or changing to some sort of workplace-based assessments. And I know from, obviously there was much discussion with schools around the country, and I'm aware that schools who already had a very robust process around workplace-based assessments were very able to implement that successfully. Somewhat unsurprisingly, if you don't have a process, a system, or any staff that are confident to deliver that, that's not really an option, and certainly wasn't for us. So this is a reminder of the timeline. So I'm going to start here, which is our finalists. And I'm also going to try and comment really with every year group on what they've missed. So final year at med school, it's quite a big deal. There's usually a big party, a big graduation ceremony, and also a big feeling of achievement, of having made it across that line. And we were in a situation where we were given a very tight deadline by the GMC to confirm or refute that each of the people in our final class were safe to graduate into the foundation programme. So starting with our finalists, they had all had their written papers in December. So the written element of finals, which is two single best answer papers, a written paper, essay paper on ethics and law had all taken place. And the planned assessments for April were two 7-station clinical exams, one on communication skills and one clinical examination. And at this point, I should mention that Cambridge students probably have more exams than any other school around the country. And so this particular year group, we also had written and clinical assessments from their previous 2 years, in addition to the written exams from year 6. So what did we do? So we reviewed the files of every, and it was a bit like this slide actually, because everything's still on paper here. So the files of every single student were reviewed. There was a big meeting of faculty around a table, and each file was gone through line by line to make sure that they'd fulfilled all of the requirements for graduation. That included attendance at all their placements, etc., etc. So it was very robust. Any queries or concerns were kind of filtered out into another group, and the gaps were filled. Probably the most difficult situation was around any fitness to practice issues, but they were addressed, and when necessary, students who were felt not to have fulfilled the institutional fitness to practice requirements were offered the opportunity to repeat their final year and were not graduated. Everyone else was signed off. So that was, where were we then? That was probably March, April time. So they went off to join the workforce and promptly graduated without a graduation. And then it was, we as I work within a kind of smaller element of the School of Medicine responsible for largely clinical communication teaching. And we were quite anxious about the supervision and support that might be available for these very new doctors who'd been graduated. A lot of them expressed the fact that they felt like they hadn't really qualified, that, you know, there might be some, of course you're the year group that didn't ever really do finals. So there was a lot of kind of uncertainty around there. So we supported our finalists with weekly open video calls to debrief experiences, largely around communication, but just to provide a safe space. What was interesting was that to begin with, we got 30 or 40, and the numbers who attended those calls dwindled over a month or so. So bye-bye final year, they were all off, and everyone else was sent home, and then we really had to rapidly deploy our teaching online. And one of the first opportunities that we took, speaking now about my role in communication skills teaching, was that we organised for all of the remaining students at all of year 4 and year 5, and we've got about 280 in each year. So we delivered all of them an experience where they undertook a recorded online consultation with a role player, and then they had a Zoom tutorial where they received formative feedback from one of our experienced facilitators. So it was kind of formative assessment, I suppose, in one of its purest forms. And there were two drivers for this, really. One was that, you know, we felt really strongly that we wanted to engage with our learners and to really demonstrate that we were trying and doing our best to make contact with them and to see all of them, to make and to check in with them, but also, crucially, to give them the experience of having undertaken that video consultation, as it was becoming very clear that that was the most likely format for the next lot of assessments. The COVID catapult. I think this probably means something different to all of us, but yeah, the next step, and I suppose one of the things I'd like to comment on is that the steps come really quickly with COVID, don't they? Every few minutes there's a new one, it would seem. So moving on to year 5, they're like the middle child, I think. I don't know about other institutions, but our year 5, it's often the year where there is the most malcontent among students. They are often unhappy, and there's a huge amount of stress about ranking. That was compounded last year by disruption to clinical placements. And then there was, again, that was uncertainty. I think we all recognise is extremely challenging. And so this year group were kind of sent home. Everybody did what they could online, and then they knew they were coming back to some sort of assessment. But it took some time to really crystallise what that would look like. Again, this year group had all their usual summative assessments in the preceding year, but they'd had significant disruption to clinical placements and also touching base with what's everybody missed out on. These guys missed out on their elective, which is again one of the highlights of your time at med school. And they returned to Cambridge in late summer. So this is where we really had to kind of face the question of, can you do an OSCE on Zoom? And then should you do an OSCE on Zoom? Because it really was Zoom. That was probably the only platform that we considered at that time. And, just touching on the principles of assessment, validity for me is a really big one. And there was discussion around whether or not we should assess communication skills, which we assess using standardised roles with role players. And then there are clinical stations, which for year 5 might involve doing a developmental assessment of a child, etc. So fairly early on as a school, we decided that undertaking clinical examination was just not sufficiently valid to make it worth the while. I believe some schools have tried that. So examples might be asking a student to describe how they would do an examination, for example. But I don't know, there are huge issues with that, because I could have, I'm reading from a screen now. I've got notes next to me. I think it's very difficult to do that with any certainty. So that kind of left the communication skills stations and also, again, reliability. So OSCE stations are largely criticised for not being particularly valid, but what they do offer is a reliable assessment, which means that then they are less subject to legal challenge. And actually, we were really worried that this would be an opportunity or this would be the point at which students just said, you know what, this isn't fair, this isn't a proper assessment, and actually you have no grounds to fail me. So there were an awful lot of different things that came into the decision making. So we decided to stick to only communication skills, and also the other issue, again thinking back to some educational theory, is around Biggs' theory of constructive alignment, where in an ideal curriculum model you assess what you've taught. I think we've stretched that to its limit this year, and our students have been extremely understanding. And then the written assessment, there was a huge debate about remote invigilation. I won't bore you with the detail, but the bottom line was that the students were absolutely clear that they did not trust each other to do a written assessment at home because of people's opportunity to cheat, for want of a better word. And so the decision was taken to do all of these assessments face-to-face on paper as per usual, and that was all done in massive exam halls with social distancing in freezing cold conditions with windows open, but as per usual. And actually that was all fine, but it was the arguments about it were significant. So that was the kind of decision making, and then we were kind of faced with, so how do you do an OSCE on Zoom? And I'm assuming all of you know what an OSCE looks like, which is basically a series of stations and the students rotate around it. And it involves, again, a key groups of people, students, examiners, in my experience, always the source of the largest problems, role players, patients. We weren't going to be using patients this time. And also, as always, the support team are vital to make sure that the wheels turn smoothly. And here we've got some of the different elements of the process, and we needed to recreate all of these in a virtual environment, because the model that we were going for was that the students would be at home, the role player would be at home, and the examiner would also be at home. And in a sort of normal OSCE, the circuit is a physical space. The station is a smaller physical space within that, and the mark sheets at that stage were not quite tablets of stone, but close papers, which were all kind of scanned using optical marking. And so this is quite a busy slide, but this is broadly how we created it. So the circuit was a Zoom meeting. And then each station was a Zoom breakout room that, you know, was relatively straightforward to achieve. I should say I didn't do this single-handedly. I've got a big acknowledgement slide at the end. But this was largely delivered by William Mayer, who is our lead educational technologist, who is amazing. And then you need someone in the room to make sure everyone's in the right place. So we had a person who was a room supervisor who was present in the main meeting, who was responsible for moving people around the breakout rooms. Timing track, there was a lot of discussion about this, but in a normal circuit. So again, in terms of, for me, it was really important that we just didn't do this because we were just proving that we could. What we really needed, if anybody fails an exam, for the students involved, it is a huge, huge thing. And so for me, it was really important that if we had to say to them, unfortunately, you haven't passed this assessment, that we knew they'd had a fair crack at it. And during a normal OSCE, there's kind of like, you know, speakers that do the timing. And my real concern was how on earth were we going to do that in a breakout room on Zoom? So I recorded timing tracks and then we had to share them with the examiners, who then had to download them and play them for every student. And prior to that, there was much discussion about whether that was actually necessary, whether it could be done just using a phone or something. But actually, that's probably the one thing I'm very clear was an absolute requirement. And the biggest challenge from students came from a single examiner who chose not to do that and did the timing on their phone and then cut a minute off each station. And that caused immense dissatisfaction, as you can imagine. And then William put all of our mark sheets onto a portfolio called My Progress, which some of you may be familiar with. It's not designed for OSCEs, although I think they've now developed an OSCE platform, and that was how they were marked. The scenarios were identical with our role players, and actually we didn't adapt them for a kind of, we just said the student instruction was undertake this consultation as if you were seeing this patient in clinic. Disaster strikes, disaster did strike, contingency is key. And then we did the way the marks were recorded in My Progress, the reporting then went straight into an Excel spreadsheet, which went into our usual kind of analytical spreadsheet. And I suppose the learning for me was that actually absolutely every element of our OSCE had to be recreated in the virtual environment. And where there was an element missing, that was largely where things went wrong. So the outcomes. So we delivered 2,800 stations in October for our Year 5. And of course, there were issues and a lot of anxiety. Wi-Fi caused probably not as much trouble as perhaps it might, as we might have thought. So we knew from our experience over the summer of doing those formative assessments that I told you about that something like I think it was something like 0.5% of those recordings had to be redone because of issues with Wi-Fi. So actually there were a few issues, but nothing like as bad as we thought there might be. There were issues with examiners, and overall, the reliability indices, so the kind of metrics which our exam is judged by, we use Cronbach's Alpha, was very, very similar to our previous exams. So overall, I'd say yes, it is possible to deliver an OSCE type experience for large numbers of students using Zoom or an alternative platform with breakout rooms. So Bob the Builder, yes, we can, but for me, the team were key. It was really important that we had a shared vision, we had the right skill sets, and it was a very small team of people who worked incredibly hard for a very short space of time. And actually we used Microsoft Teams for that, which worked really well. You know, just kind of messaging, I've done my bit, over to you, that kind of thing. That was the first time I'd really worked on a project in that way. So that was another learning point. So should we? I'm not sure, and there are huge issues around remote assessments. I think for clinical assessment, it's even less valid than an OSCE. which already has concerns around validity. And I personally wouldn't attempt virtual clinical examination stations simply because, for the sake of it. Maybe the next iteration using simulation or perhaps VR headsets, who knows? But for now, I think with the equipment that we have available to us, I'm not sure I would go down that route. Written exams, as I've alluded to, remote, I think everyone around the country has found this very challenging. Remote proctoring is a nightmare, and there's huge suspicion amongst the students that, and there are huge issues around trust. So we have continued to do all of our written assessments face-to-face. So that's kind of my view on assessment. So kind of continuing on that face-to-face element, I just wanted to pause because I'm going to move on to teaching in a minute, but really to comment on some of the tensions that we've seen over the year, in that medical education takes place in a clinical environment and it's taught by clinical staff. The other half of my job takes place in a hospital, on wards and in clinics. And the personal experience of the pandemic has been so different for everyone. However, largely the support staff for teaching, the support is provided by non-clinical staff who work solely within a university environment. And I think for me and many of my clinical colleagues, the return to a classroom often felt a bit safer relative to being in the front line, or even the day-to-day working in areas where social distancing is impossible. In our clinic, you just can't social distance. There'll be 15 of us in a tiny office. Or, and that's just the norm for people who work in the NHS. And then I've noticed that, people who have literally worked from home and who have been, unable to leave really to come out to work, have actually found that return to a physical space much more frightening. And there was often as well an institutional, very different approach to risk assessment between the NHS, where it's it's a pragmatism by necessity, and the university, who would often have were often much more risk averse for staff, which is, I think, the ideal situation. It's just you can't really do it in the NHS. Other issues that we had were people were working at home, often using their own computers. That didn't always work really well. So I feel really strongly that if we're asking staff to work at home, they need to have the appropriate resource in order to be able to do their job. And of course, I haven't even mentioned homeschooling, but I thought it was probably safer to stay off that one. Okay, so I could probably pause for any questions on assessment, Isla, or I could just carry on, whichever you think is best.
Well, there's a couple that are linked to the written exams. Keith from University of Leicester say that they've piloted and used ExamSoft for exams.
Right.
And there's lots of work on addressing the technical issues and student worries, and that they also do written exams remotely, and there's safeguards to make cheating more difficult. But he's not sure how it went. I don't know if you'd heard of that as a solution or.
Well, yeah, so I've heard lots of kind of anecdotes. The head of assessment here goes to the MSc AA meetings, and so I've heard lots of because we've debated this endlessly, and I know there were some institutions that invested hugely in kind of remote proctoring, which is stuff like there's another webcam, that observes or that looks at, looks for eye movement. So, for example, say I'm doing an exam now on a screen, and then I look away like this and look at something on my phone or a book. Anecdotally, I've heard it's not that effective, and I think that's, and also I think the biggest problem is the perception amongst the student body that people will cheat and that it's just not fair. And when you couple that with the kind of the issues around ranking, and I don't know, I can only speak to our own institution, but in year 5, when ranking becomes an issue, it's almost toxic, the environment. And, and they all seem to think that, one exam will move them from the 9th decile to the 1st or something. It just becomes really, really difficult to manage. I think anything that contributes to that lack of trust, uncertainty and anxiety is unlikely to be a goer, no matter how effective the software is. So I think the jury's out for me on that one.
That's what the other comments were in relation to, the lack of trust between students of their peers, and that competitiveness, and the massive fixation that students have on exams and they must be first, and it's like, oh my god, you poor things, you've been taught how to be exam robots and you can't think of anything else. They're so oriented. But yeah, that trust issue with their colleagues.
Yeah, and also I don't know, it's no smoke without fire. You know, they are technologically much more savvy than we are. Well, speaking for myself, you all might. I was like, oh, librarians, I bet they're all really good at technology. And actually, I've got a question for you as an audience at the end, actually, but I'm not going to tell you what it is now. So, yeah, but the lack of trust is overwhelming. And also, you know, like a decile is a decile. I don't think they necessarily appreciate that means that the year group is divided into 10 groups that are all equal in size. I think they think there's a real perception that if they get 85% in an exam, they'll move up 2 deciles. They don't realise that somebody else has got to do badly. Anyway, I could talk all day about ranking. Anyway.
Thank you.
So, okay, so I'll move on to our experiences of teaching. So the students all came back and we returned to the classroom. And I think by that time, it's fair to say we were all a little bit more experienced with the available tools. And also, you know, I think it's been a difficult year for everyone, but it's quite good fun when someone goes, oh, have you tried this? Or I've had a go with this, or I'm doing a talk, you know, and I want to try Mentimeter, and can you just test drive it with me so I don't look like an idiot in front of 300 students? You know, that sort of thing. There's been a huge, yes, there's been some fun, and for me that's, you know, been a huge positive, the speed at which we've adopted new stuff and tried to use it. So I'm going to talk about sort of clinical teaching, theoretical teaching a little bit. So this is supposed to represent a group of clinical medical students. I love Google Images, but anyway. So by this I mean broadly skills teaching. So practical skills, communication skills, bedside teaching of examination, etc. And so what have we tried to this effect? So our Cambridge students they all have weekly supervisions with junior doctors as part of a clinical supervisors programme. And to begin with, when they first came back, there was still kind of reluctance to let them on the wards. And so there was a pilot using Zoom and iPads and that sort of thing, which I think was better than nothing. But at the end of the day, you know, unless you feel the liver, you probably don't really learn from it. Would be so for me, I'm still quite old school in terms of, you know, if to learn to examine a patient effectively, you need to examine that patient and learn from their experience. And then for communication skills, actually, we put everyone back in the classroom as soon as they came back. We did it all with in a COVID secure environment. We're lucky we've got a really modern building that's got all the filters that suck out all the bad things. And we did it with Trust PPE and modelled it very much as, you know, you had to wear a surgical mask, etc., etc. And that was a challenge. There were real tensions with our support staff, who were still at that point being told that they should be working from home, but we very much needed them to be in the building. So there were some tricky conversations around that. But actually, in the end, everyone pulled together and it was really, really positive, and I'm very glad that we did it. And what we did was in December, again, you know, you can't. I think maybe we're just naive. We thought, oh, it won't be that bad, but of course it was. It was even worse. And so we reluctantly had to stop face-to-face teaching after that. But prior to that, actually, it was fine. Nobody got COVID in one of our teaching sessions. We had loads of debate around should we wear masks, or should we get the special masks with kind of that have got clear panels to enhance communication. But actually, we said, right, no, you just have to do what we're doing in the hospital. And I found that really helpful. As a kind of manager, risk assessor, all those kind of stuff, is to say, whatever happens in the hospital, that's what you need to learn to do. Actually, that's who you need to learn to be. So that's what we use as a benchmark. So that's the sort of small group sessions. And then when we were unable to teach face-to-face anymore, again, with the new redeployment in January, that became really challenging because it's not quite as straightforward as just moving everything online, because of course all of our teachers are also doing other stuff. So I've got 3 wonderful tutors who were all redeployed to palliative care and to COVID wards. So just having the people to deliver the teaching is difficult. And so what we did was we pared our curricular offering right down to the bare minimum and delivered that online. This is something to hark back to Isla's introduction. I would dump that at the earliest opportunity, because it's similar to the bedside teaching. It's better than nothing, but it's not the same. And equally, we give a lot of our sessions are modelled around feedback. It's quite hard to give developmental feedback and not be able to assess the impact that you've had on a learner's emotional response and that sort of thing. So it feels a little bit unsafe to me. So we're not keen on that. So we won't be doing that beyond when we have to. The other things we've done is try to develop kind of online resources to help learners with some of the objectives. So we've developed kind of seminars, online learning packs. We're all much better at putting things into our VLE, etc. And that has evolved all the time over the year. Our latest iteration is going to be it's a resource to supplement a session which they're not all getting around interviewing the elderly patients. And we've got one of our Medicine for the Elderly colleagues who's doing a talk about her top tips around communicating with elderly patients. And when we've spliced in, not me obviously, video clips of demonstrative stuff with role players, which were recorded on Zoom. And then we're going to use those in a flipped classroom model. So the students will access all of that first. Then there'll be some didactic content, and then we're going to break them out. This is the most risky thing, is going to break them out into role play and trios in breakout rooms for about 70 students, and then make them do the role plays, which is very new for us. I don't know about that last bit. Ask me back next year and I'll update you as to how it went. My other big learning thing is I do love a pilot. So what I didn't say about those year 5 assessments was that actually we'd piloted it all with a year 4 formative process earlier in the year. So for me, it's about lots of things in terms of quality and assurance, but just knowing that everybody knows what they're going to do, involving students so that you can get that feedback on what they find useful, what they don't. So I'm very reluctant to just throw everything at a good idea and then hope that it works. Love a pilot. And that's kind of all I've really got to say about clinical teaching. And I suppose the take home for me would be actually clinical teaching largely needs to take place in a clinical environment, but there are things that we've discovered to kind of mitigate a little bit. Theoretical teaching. So by this I mean teaching that would usually take place in large groups. And again, this is only in the clinical years. I'm not going to comment on sort of preclinical practicals and that sort of thing. And I think for me, and I'd be interested to hear others' views, this is where the biggest wins have been. So our students have been campaigning for years for lecture capture. And I imagine there have been similar discussions in other institutions, and this has been resisted for a variety of reasons. And actually, March last year, we had no choice, and the students are delighted. I think from a kind of faculty point of view, actually, it offers a lot more flexibility. You can pre-record bits. There's no longer that diary nightmare of realising that one of your speakers 3 hours before has, put March in instead of April. The whole thing becomes much more flexible. There are issues around consent, storage. I think keeping the content fresh and up to date for our learners is really important, and we haven't had to address that yet. But what happens about the hygiene of the resources that you have? How do you keep making sure that what you've got isn't very, very dated? There are, I think we have to acknowledge, the big losses for a small minority of lecturers who just love the experience. I think we all know who those colleagues are in our institutions. But I'm always quite surprised by they have to come to a lecture, I don't know. I find, given the extensive literature that shows that actually large lectures are not particularly effective, I find the fact that we still do so many of them interesting. So other features. So I think we've learned so much in a year about the interaction of people in large groups. And, a breakout room is, for that experience is probably more effective, I think, than the turn to your neighbour and chat option, which we would often use in a lecture. I've used things like Google Jamboard, which I find really useful to activate students' prior learning. It's really good for generating a group agenda. It's anonymous. I don't know if anyone's used it. It's quite good fun. You can do post-it notes and that sort of thing. So I've used that quite effectively. There was a bit in the chat at lunchtime about polling software, and I would absolutely echo many of the comments indicating that resources such as Slido, Mentimeter, etc., which promote learner participation and engagement, and also I think offer a space for other voices. So perhaps learners who might not be confident enough to offer up a question will do that with the security of anonymity. We have had unfortunate situations where anonymity has been perhaps abused, but very few. And again, even the simple things of questions in the chat, it provides room and opportunity for everyone to ask. As I was writing this, I did reflect on the choice I've made today to not include any of those things. I thought I could have been a bit braver and offered a Jamboard at the beginning to set a group agenda, but in the end I bottled it in front of an unfamiliar audience, in the risk that you might say, oh, we want to hear about something that I wasn't able to speak to, so apologies for that. But I think we've all tried lots of different things, and I think many of those are really, really useful that we'll definitely take forward. So I'm coming to the end now. I think the biggest win has been around accessibility. Here we are today in a conference. I wonder how many of us would not have been able to participate if attendance had required travel and time away from home and work. Many of the sort of larger medical conferences that I attend are always attended by the same people, usually senior members of teams, often doctors, and often people who don't have to juggle domestic commitments. So for me, the fact that people are able to access conferencing, large group CPD from their living room is just a huge step forward. And 12 months ago, I delivered, so I'm the clinical lead for the East of England Child Diabetes Network, which sounds a lot grander than it actually is. But actually, the impact of COVID in the NHS has been, so we've heard a lot about ITU, etc., and that's all been awful, but actually for children with chronic illness, it's been a disaster. So a lot of our clinical work just stopped. And so I worked with an amazing network manager called Kate Wilson. So we were having a conversation on the phone about what could we do to try and keep people engaged. And I just said, well, I've got a talk that I usually give at a meeting. Why don't I give that? We'll try Teams. And I delivered it to our local network. And that at those meetings, we would normally get about 25 people, and we had 45. I think perhaps reflecting the fact that people, weren't that busy as well. But I just think it's easier if you don't have to get in the car and drive. And so crucially for me, there were some professionals there who'd never been able to attend face-to-face sessions. And that has developed to a monthly webinar now. We get audiences of around 150 people from across the UK every month. And the ethos is to deliver conference standard speakers to people's living room and offices. We're reaching a far wider group than we ever would have before, and I'm pretty certain that well over a quarter or even a half of our attendees would never get to an international conference. And crucially for me, and I think this is really important, it's absolutely free from the oversight and support of the pharmaceutical industry. I know you have publishers in the librarian world, but we can do this entirely in its purest form without any oversight. And for me, it gives a true feeling of altruism and community. And I don't know if anybody saw the kind of medical education in the time of COVID stuff that went on, but students, as always, very, very resourceful, and they had a whole programme of speakers that they organised themselves. So that for me has possibly been the biggest win. Just conscious of time. So again, accessibility, recorded lectures, you know, the days of having to send stuff for laborious transcripts are over. You can use Panopto or Zoom, you can export a transcript, and they're not 100%, but they're pretty good. And then learners can watch in their own time at double speed. And actually we've had, so we do captions just because it's a legal requirement now, but we've had a surprising number of spontaneous comments of appreciation from our learners about the captions. What will we keep? I've said quite a bit about this already, and actually I suspect we don't really know, because who knows? You know, I'm speaking to you from an empty building. You know, who will come back and when? There's such uncertainty around, you know, people's working situations, etc. I suppose for me, I look back, the biggest positive has been the realisation we're able to generate a great deal of new content to deadlines that would have been unimaginable 18 months ago. And that collective sense of urgency has resulted in a really, truly remarkable work rate. However, this has come at huge cost. People are tired, and so I'm not really sure what will happen after all of this. An anecdote, we've done some hilarious quizzes which have been very well received, but it's a low bar at the moment for social events, so I think we'll all be quite glad to see the back of a Zoom quiz, or not, I don't know. So acknowledgements. So these people here, Claire, Alistair, William and Alison, were part of the very small team that delivered those online assessments back in October. And it was, I think for me, it was one of the things I'm most proud of, being a part of that team. It was also hugely stressful. I had the worst emails I've ever had from students, a very small number, but it was really stressful. And then this group here, Debbie, Steph, Mandy, JB, Anna, Patria, Sanchita, Kim, Laura, Pooja and Liz are my clinical communications team, who have been amazing through all of this. And you know, I think every time we go, right, we're going to do this, that then has a knock-on effect to around scheduling, booking, cancelling, all of that, which they've just been absolutely brilliant. And I thought, it's not Zoom without some random animals appearing and I'm not at home. So here's the obligatory Zoom cat and dog. And I very much hope this has been of interest. That's the downside of a Zoom lecture, isn't it? I can't see any of your faces, and there's no microphones on, so I can't tell whether anybody even smiled at my bad jokes. But I'd just like to thank you for your attention and open up for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I was laughing. and the fact that my cat hasn't stomped across my keyboard and all the rest of it so far is an astonishment. But thank you very, very much indeed. You said you had a question for us.
I did, which was, my perception is that librarians have probably quite enjoyed the embracing of technology, and I wondered whether that was true.
Well, there's a couple of comments about people who've really moved all their teaching that they've done online, and they've gone through, I mean, speaking personally, we've gone through that same jump off a cliff as you have, in terms of we can't do face-to-face, we've got to do it online. I think the mix of the synchronous and the asynchronous, we have put guides up onto our websites. We've created things called libguides quite a lot, and many libraries rely on this format. A libguide is the solution to all possible problems of asynchronous support and training. But I know that the opening up of training that we offer online and not being restricted to a certain number of bums on seats, because the training room has only got 6 computers or whatever it is, has opened up huge possibilities. And in the chat, you can probably see there's quite a lot of agreement in relation to that, about loving the technology, about Panopto being used on a regular basis, and the fact that it can reach so many more people. And for those of us who've got a mix of clinical and academic responsibility, meaning that we don't have to pull somebody in on their day off for them to travel into the library to get that training session. They can do it from home. All the same benefits that you've described with the conference quality speakers in their living room, all of that matches what we're doing to a huge extent. I think the tension between the risk-averse university and the risk pragmatism in the NHS is a really interesting one. That
was that diplomatic enough?
Well, we've got a mixed audience of some people who are pure NHS librarians here, as well as some pure HEI, and myself. I mean, you know, I support the trust as well as the university, but I think that's a very good point about how, yeah, there's just different interpretations of what risk is,
and how comfortable you feel in an environment. So, you know, even at home. So my husband's worked from home for a year. And I'm like, well, at least you don't have to go into the hospital. And he's like, well, at least you don't have to stay at home with our children every day. You know, it's you know, there's, I think everyone's lived their own version of hell over the last 12 months, haven't they?
Yes, whether it's been denied access to the workplace or being forced in a way that they felt uncomfortable. It's yeah, every different version of good and bad. I'm conscious of time and your clinical commitments as well that you're taking on. There's loads of comments, and I'll make sure that I share them with you as well. It's been really interesting, the insight to get into the fact that yes, you can't do clinical education entirely by Zoom.
You really can't.
Yeah.
That's just my personal opinion, but I just, and then
well, yeah, as a potential patient, I don't think I would have wanted somebody to have been taught entirely online, because I mean, even the colour definition, if you were looking for some discoloration on the skin or any of those practical situations, regardless of actually touching and physical exam, it just doesn't cut it. So it's really interesting about what's possible and what should be.
Can I just comment on the personal experience of communicating with an elderly patient? Is that top tip number one was to think about hearing impairment and also how to assist with that. So that's very much part of the learning for that session.
Interesting.
I hope that reassures.
Thank you so much for your time today.
That's
Rachel.
an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone.
It's tremendous. Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, and I hope it's an easy clinic for you.
Thanks a lot. Bye. Thank you.